Colleagues, good afternoon. We're very happy to see you. We're about to start the press conference by the Governor of the Bank of Russia, Elvira Nabiullina, and the Deputy Governor, Alexei Zabotkin. And to begin with, we will hear the statement by the Governor following the Board of Directors meeting. Good afternoon. Today, we have made the decision to keep the key rate at 7.5% per annum. The situation has significantly changed recently. On the one hand, foreign trade conditions have worsened notably as Russian crude prices went down. On the other hand, the situation in the economy is developing better than expected in the October forecast. The structure of demand continues to alter. Consumption remains subdued. The growth of private investment is slowing down, whereas budget expenditures are increasing. Besides, pro-inflationary risks have risen overall. In view of this, the key rate is more likely to be raised rather than cut this year. The rationale for changing the key rate will depend on future developments. I would now dwell on the reasons behind our today's decision. Inflation trends remain moderate. By the moment, we do not yet have complete statistics on inflation in January, but weekly data show that current price growth probably sped up in January, reaching the maximum rate since April 2022, leaving out the periods of the indexation of administered tariffs. This acceleration is primarily associated with volatile components such as fruit and vegetables. But more steady components, for example, prices for services, are also contributing to it. Overall, the growth of prices for steady components of inflation is still moderate, according to our estimates. This is largely explained by subdued consumer demand. Household spending for large purchases, namely real estate, cars, repairs, and foreign travel, has declined amid changes in supply and high uncertainty. Some households prefer to save these funds instead, as the propensity to save is now high. Nevertheless, there have been emerging signs of an improvement in consumer sentiment recently. A revival in consumer activity may be driven by inflation expectations that remain elevated. Companies' price expectations also stay considerably above their multi-year averages. Inflation expectations included in interest rates on federal government bonds also exceed the inflation target. Despite a gradual increase in current price growth rates, annual inflation will considerably drop in the next few months due to the base effect. As we have already said, annual inflation will very likely drop even below 4% in spring from today's 11.8%. However, this will not reflect current inflation trends and will only be because the high rates when prices peaked in March-April 2022 will be excluded from the calculation of annual inflation. The structural transformation of the economy, the completion of the pass-through of businesses' higher costs to consumer prices, and the existing external trade restrictions will still affect price growth this year. Our monetary policy takes this into account. It is aimed at stabilizing inflation close to the target of 4% in 2024, considering the extent of the impact of these factors on the economy. Major structural shifts in the economy are still underway. We have improved our GDP forecast for this year. This is associated with an upward revision of the assessments for previous periods on the one hand, and with higher budget expenditures than assumed in our October forecast on the other hand. Structural changes in the economy cause a steady expansion of output in a number of sectors, while others are facing a decline in their output. The former include, among others, some manufacturing sectors and construction that are ramping up their output. Transportation infrastructure is quickly developing, with government investment becoming increasingly important in this industry. Contrastingly, investment projects in the private sector can be suspended or decreased because the required equipment is unavailable or companies are uncertain about future demand. The contribution of budget expenditures to aggregate demand dynamics is growing overall. A major indicator of structural shifts in the economy is the labor market. Unemployment has declined to its record low. Staff shortages in agriculture and construction are becoming more acute. As to Russian regions, staff shortages are most serious in the Urals and Siberia due to the expansion of the industrial sector in these regions, as well as in the Far East, where there is new logistic and trade infrastructure being built. Structural changes are inevitably entail higher costs in many sectors. Detailed analytics on this topic are available in the February issue of the Regional Economy Report prepared by the Bank of Russia's main branches. Nonetheless, the pressure put by higher costs on prices will be weakening gradually. Already now, we can observe some improvements in logistics, specifically in the transportation of imported goods from Far Eastern seaports to European Russia. Summing up, it is possible to say that the economy is actively adjusting to the current developments. Our assessment of the GDP decline over 2022 is 2.5%. This year, GDP is forecast to change from -1% to +1%. Now, I would like to speak of external conditions. Global recession risks have decreased. There are three factors that have improved sentiment in world markets. The first contributor is the reopening of the Chinese economy after the country lifted its coronavirus restrictions. The second driver is that central banks in advanced economies, which are striving to bring down their inflation rates, are now close to the peaks of their policy rates. The third factor is a reduction in energy commodity prices, first of all in Europe. All this has a favorable effect on developing market economies, including Russia's key trading partners. However, the positive influence of these developments on Russia will be restricted by the sanctions. As compared to our previous forecast, we have revised the impact of the sanctions on Russian crude. The Russian oil sector was adjusting to the changes in December-January by decreasing prices rather than output. Today, the government has announced that beginning from March, Russia will voluntarily reduce oil production by 500,000 barrels per day. We will monitor how this decision will be influencing oil price trends. Nevertheless, we have lowered our forecast for oil prices in 2023 as compared to October. As before, we published the forecast Urals crude price in the table with the forecast. However, when preparing our macroeconomic forecast, we now take into account in greater detail that after the enactment of the price caps, export prices for Russian oil significantly vary depending on its grades and shipping points. Accordingly, the actual average export price for Russian crude and its forecast might substantially differ from Urals benchmark prices. As to possible implications of the embargo on petroleum products, it was enacted just a few days ago, and its effects are still to be assessed. We have revised our forecast of the balance of payments for this year. The forecast of exports has decreased, whereas that of imports to the country has been improved, taking into account the trends of recent months. As a result, the forecast surplus of the current account for 2023 has been reduced to $66 billion. For the inflation forecast, this means a pro-inflationary shift caused by external conditions. Monetary conditions have stayed neutral overall, although individual indicators have been changing diversely. Since our December meeting, the yield curve of federal government bonds has shifted upwards by 10 to 55 basis points, and the slope of the curve has increased even more. Yields are still affected by elevated economic uncertainty, coupled with substantial supply of government securities in the primary market. The situation in the credit market has remained unchanged. The corporate loan portfolio continues to expand in a double-digit pace. This growth is partially associated with structural shifts, including the substitution of borrowings in Western markets that are now inaccessible. The deposit market is stable. In our opinion, the accelerated growth of funds in individuals' accounts in December was caused by an increase in budget payments rather than a further rise in their propensity to save. At the end of last year, companies received considerable funds from the budget to their accounts. At the beginning of 2023, this trend continued. The flows of budgetary funds will affect aggregate demand regardless of how they are being used. Even when budgetary funds are used to finance investment projects or make government purchases, a considerable portion of them is ultimately paid as wages to employees working at these projects and production facilities. The pace at which the impact of these budgetary flows will translate into price movements will depend on how quickly they will move into consumption. The annual expansion of money supply continued to speed up in December-January. This was primarily driven by higher government expenditures at the end of last year and the rescheduling of a part of payments under state orders for the beginning of 2023. This earlier budget spending intensifies the impact of fiscal policy on aggregate demand in the first half of the year. The resulting effect on inflation will depend on changes in other components of aggregate demand. However, all else being equal, maintaining the same inflation path amid higher demand from the government, a greater contribution of the budget to the extension of money supply somewhat reduces room for growth in credit to the economy. I will now speak of the risks that might cause a deviation of inflation from the baseline forecast. According to our estimate, the balance of risks has shifted towards pro-inflationary ones even more. In addition to the more significant impact of fiscal policy, which I have already mentioned, I should speak of three more risks. First of all, this is a fast rise in consumption amid elevated inflation expectations, which is possible if the factors constraining consumer activity weaken. The second risk is increasing staff shortages and a slower growth rate of labor productivity as compared to that of wages. And finally, there is still a serious risk of a further tightening of the sanctions. Winding up, I would like to comment on our future decisions. Despite the strengthening of pro-inflationary factors mentioned above, our forecast of inflation for this year remains at 5 to 7%. I would like to note that for this we might need a higher path of the key rate than assumed in October. In our updated forecast for this year and the next year, the ranges of the average key rate have been revised upwards by 0.5 percentage point to 7 to 9% per annum for this year and 6.5 to 7.5 per annum for the next year. This does not mean that the key rate cannot be cut this year, but this probability and the extent of this decrease have become lower. In contrast, there is now a higher probability that we might need to raise the key rate somewhat in order to bring inflation in 2024 close to 4%. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. Dear colleagues, now over to your questions. Don't forget to introduce yourself and your agency. Good afternoon, Savelyev Anastasia, Interfax. Could you please say to what extent the pro-inflationary effect is meaningful or significant from the angle of the fiscal factor? Has it become a surprise that the January budget was fully performed, particularly in terms of a growing expenditure? And to what extent this particular factor impacted your decision to bring back into the statement very tough signal so as to announce the possibility of the rate being brought up? And my second question is not really about the monetary policy, because right now there is a discussion about making compulsory for the companies to issue substitute bonds instead of the euro bonds. Do you believe that should be made a compulsion so as to force the companies to do that, or should it be simply just advised? And traditionally, what kind of options you considered today on the table? Well, as far as pro-inflationary effects are concerned from the side of the budget, the government demand supports the aggregate demand. And the effect of additional spending, which was funded in 2022, as well as an accelerated government order performance that we see in January spending, the effect from this could be really meaningful. But the ultimate response from the monetary policy to this factor depends upon the general picture of the aggregate demand rather than just the government demand, although its role is becoming more pronounced. And so if the government demand temporarily substitutes the constrained private demand that we see now, the effect upon the aggregate demand can be neutral. Now, if there is a transition towards a much more stable and much more significant structural budget deficit, if that happens, then the space to maneuver and to expand the private demand and the credit in the economy shrinks. So at this point in time, we act on the previously announced government gradual consolidation of the budget. And the government announcement actually is reflected in the budget information at the electronic budget portal. As far as the size of the budget deficit is concerned, a lot of it depends upon the way the macroeconomic situation unfolds, and certainly additional deficit increases the contribution by the government demand into the aggregate demand. That is why it does impact inflation. Apart from how I said it at the very beginning, apart from the budget spending dynamics and then the budget deficit dynamics, this impact comes also from the way the spending is distributed in time. If it is concentrated within specific months and specific quarters, during that period it may produce a greater inflationary pressure and can be reflected upon higher inflationary expectations and bring about secondary effects. We need to take into account. I also want to draw attention to the following thing. Inflation is impacted not by the timing when the budget allocates funds, but when it reaches the end consumers, goes into the consumption, when it is being used by products and services. There could be lags. There are lags here, particularly when the government purchasing is funded in advance. We can see it. But here you must interpret it not as a lag effect, but rather as an effect which is distributed in time. And of course, the monetary policy factor is a meaningful one in defining the inflation picture, and we shall definitely monitor the way this situation develops and respectively take it into account in our monetary policy decisions, which, I shall say it again, is aimed at bringing inflation back to the target within 2024. The second question was about the substitution bonds. There were three questions, I'm sorry. So the second question about the substitution bonds. Indeed, this is just a recommendation now, but in terms of the whole issue of substitution bonds, we are aimed at undoubtedly protecting the rights of the Russian holders of bonds. And therefore we believe it is necessary to switch from recommendations to the rule setting so as to make it a compulsory thing to issue substitution bonds. Of course, the situation can be more complex. Different situations may entail different consequences. And I suppose that we should keep the possibility of such an exception, but with a valid review for the need of such an exception within an interagency commission. That is our position. As far as the options are concerned that we reviewed, like reducing the rate was not considered. There were other ideas voiced to raise the rate, but nevertheless the consensus evolved with respect towards keeping the rate as it is. And with a bit of a toughening of a signal, and in terms of the detailed discussion of the higher rate, no, we didn't look into that. Thank you very much. I have two questions. Does central bank maintain its forecast for the neutral rate, around 6%? And the second question, since you are expecting a certain inflation decline during the spring months, what are the inflationary peaks within the year that we should expect? I mean, because the situation is such. Thank you. As far as the neutral rate forecast is concerned, principally speaking, against a stable increase in the structural budget deficit, there can also be a certain rising of the key rate. It's just a general observation. But overall, we see in the nature of the neutral rate, when we put together our main guidelines for the monetary policy in the summer period, and this year we will do it again, and we would also consider the need to update our assessment. But this update not necessarily should mean any change in our ideas about the neutral rate. So we will revisit this issue in summer. As far as the inflation dynamics are concerned, I mean, the reduction of the annual inflation, I shall underscore, in spring below 4% is purely related to the base effect, because this base effect will then emerge, and you should rather than look at the inflation dynamics and at the forecast for the inflation factors, which is what we do. But in terms of the possible peaks, I will ask Alexei Borisovich to comment. Thank you very much for the question. As you may know, in terms of the monthly inflation, we're trying not to forecast it that way, but from the point of view of the general picture, indeed, this annual inflation dynamics throughout the 12 months period will be very strongly defined by the last year's month, which fell out of the estimate because we had some high peaks in March and April. So once they fall out of the estimate template, then the annual inflation will very quickly fall below 4%, and we will witness that in April, May this year. But after that, a very low monthly price growth will fall out, which we remember from July and August and almost until the end of the year. And as they fall out from our estimate, the annual inflation figure will start growing, and towards the end of the year, we expect it to be somewhere in between 5 to 7%. Gina, please. Thank you. RIA Novosti, dear Sonsovet. I also have two questions. The first one, Elvira Sahibzadovna, do you already have an assessment as to when the GDP this year, I mean, within which quarter it may move into the positive, and the probability of it towards the end of the year remaining in the black? Is it stronger than being just -1? And my second question about the reserves. The central bank, we know, stopped publishing the details about the reserve. What is the probability, and when might you go back to disclosing the data, both about the structure, or maybe you would also change the timing for such publications? Thank you. With regard to the GDP dynamics, it's quarterly, quarter-to-quarter dynamics. It has been a positive one both in the third and the fourth quarters, and so if we are to speak about the annual performance, then in our mind the positive area is where the GDP will enter into in the middle of this year. In as far as the general assessment of the GDP for this year is concerned, we are coming out with a symmetrical range from -1 to +1. And in as far as disclosing the reserve data is concerned, we're currently discussing it, so I'm not able to give you the timing for it. Thank you. The next question comes from the region. Julia Mizonova, Abakan.ru portal, please. Good afternoon, Julia Mizonova from the Republic of Khakassia. I've got the following question. The Bank of Russia recently stated that the real wage growth provokes inflation. So it happens that the MAGA regulator is against the quality of life improving, so we will live poorly, we will buy less, and the prices won't grow, and the inflation is going to be low, something that everybody's trying to achieve. No, this is totally not the case. On the contrary, we are for a stable growth of real wages. But the stable increase of the real wages is possible only against the productivity growing. Otherwise, the wage growing will be gobbled up by inflation. And something that we draw attention to is when labor productivity is lagging behind the wage growth, such growth of real wages cannot be sustainable. A worker's income can grow sustainably only if it is accompanied by an increase of the output of the products that are being produced by this worker. Otherwise, everything is going to be consumed by inflation, and eventually the real income will decrease because fewer products are going to be produced, and that would mean that people definitely would be poorer than now. Rita, please. Margarita Mordovina, RBK. I will have two questions. The first one is related to the government's initiatives on one-time contribution into the budget out of the income that business generated in 2022. Is Bank of Russia participating in the discussion of this initiative? Does it support it or does it not? And based on what you think, this initiative, could it reduce the risks of the budget deficit growing or somehow impact inflation? And my second question about additional capitalization of banks last year for 2023. The Bank of Russia forecast that the additional capitalization will be requiring additional 7 billion. Now, did this figure take into account the additional capitalization for VTB in the amount of 500 billion? If not, what is the new prediction for the additional capitalization for this year? As far as the possible voluntary contribution by businesses into the budget, this is part of the tax policy, and in this particular case, we're not involved in its discussion. If there is such a decision made, we will take it into account in our monetary policy. As far as additional capitalization of the banks are concerned, first of all, we're not commenting on individual banks, but in our forecast and in our assessment for the potential needs for capitalization, we took into account all the major banks, definitely, practically all of them, and based on this estimate of ours, with regard to the need for additional capitalization, it can be reduced. We didn't come out with any specific ones, but overall we assess the banking industry having a lower need as compared to the assessments previously. Yes, colleagues, please, Dmitry. Dmitry Butenko, Kommersant. I will have one question about the unemployment. The central bank doesn't come out with a separate forecast as to the labor market situation, but nevertheless, it seems quite obvious that unemployment currently is falling down faster than previously expected and at a higher pace. So my question, do you believe that there is a certain unemployment level against which the effects from low unemployment, essentially negative in some of the regions, will be multiplied, and that is quite dangerous? What happens with it? And I'm not going to come up with some separate comments about the state of the labor market, because in your press release you specifically make an emphasis upon these conditions. Well, it is true that the situation in the labor market is an important indicator of what is happening in the economy, including the structural changes, and it does affect our assessment of pro-inflationary or disinflationary risks. We see that unemployment went down to a historical minimum record level. Will it go further down? It's impossible to say, because there is always a certain value of structural unemployment against low mobility, and simultaneously, even if unemployment is not going to low down, the tension in the labor market may grow, and the shortage of it in certain sectors may be felt more acutely, which is related to the economic restructuring, whereby the demand for labor grows in the industries which are growing faster, and we certainly are monitoring it scrupulously, and we will think about whether we should need to offer detailed assessments. Alexei Borisovich, would you add something? Yes, I would say that specifically about the level of employment in the economy. The level of employment is growing, and unemployment is not only going down, but it's at the historically record low levels, and it's just not in terms of the general indicators, but that concerns broader kind of indicators, the so-called partial employment that the Russian Office of Statistics also estimates, and the one that we do take into account whenever we discuss the key rate. But what was mentioned in the governor's statement. Eventually, if the labour productivity lags behind from the growth of the wages, there won't be enough products produced in order to fully meet the growing needs, and which, in the end of the day, may transform itself into a faster inflation. This is the core channel through which the labour market impacts the price stability as well as the well-being of the people, because if inflation fully consumes the nominal wage growth, this high employment doesn't generate any benefits. Thank you. Next question comes from a blogger, Alexander Wald, Life and Invest. Good afternoon. Could you please tell us the whole fund of the FINEX management company covers the Russian assets, and currently this fund cannot resume its operations because effectively it's an unfriendly entity. Is there any chance that this fund will be able to resume its work, and the dividends which the fund earns and can be reinvested cannot be reinvested right now, and they're credited to the Type C accounts, as far as I understand, but following the statements of the management company, 98% of investors in this fund are Russians. Is there any mechanism that investors can follow in order to change the situation? The second piece of news was that the Minister of Finance and the Central Bank came up with a proposition to reissue the bonds which were brought from the foreign jurisdiction into the Russian one. And that particular mechanism can also mean that the securities can be bought from Russian investors with a discount. Is there any review going on of this particular mechanism, and where does it come from? As far as the resumption of the fund's operation is concerned, I'm not going to comment specifically about. Overall, I shall say that if the fund is utilizing foreign infrastructure, then in order to resume its operations, it requires a decision both on the part of the foreign as well as the Russian regulators. Our permit, our agreement, as one of the core conditions, is to present transparent, reliable system of accounting, which would make sure that the Russian investors are getting all the payments due. To us, the most important thing is for Russian investors to be fully protected. As far as possible buyout of bonds is concerned, back in August, the Bank of Russia made a decision about the so-called half-year quarantine with regards to the securities by our issues, the accounting of which goes back to the Russian infrastructure for the purpose of financial stability. Towards the end of December, we have extended it further for additional 6 months, and the requirements remain towards standalone accounting for these securities. But as far as buying out of these bonds is concerned, such ideas have not been voiced, and there is no discussion taking place right now. Gulia, please. Gulnara Vahitova, RIA Novosti. Good afternoon, Elvira Nabiullina. I will have several questions. First, about the Ministry of Finance statement that the share of euros in the course of the year is going to be brought down to zero in the structure of the Federal National Welfare Fund. Will it affect the monetary policy? Another question, quite rhetorical, against continuous possible external sanctions, doesn't it make sense right now to change the inflation target, because in spring it will go down? Despite the base effect below 4%, maybe it would make sense to raise the inflation target. And similarly, I would like to ask you about the central bank signal. The regulator's rhetoric has toughened, and the economists now see this signal as a possibility for the banks to further raise their rates on loans and deposits. How can you comment this? With regard to the Minister of Finance, euro holdings brought down to zero. It doesn't affect monetary policy as far as changing inflation targets. Sanctions do not impact the inflation target change. We're going to hold the monetary policy review, and we shall consider various issues. But it is not about raising the target, more probably about lowering the inflation target, but the format of the target and other issues. I think we've published the format within which we're going to do this review. And principally speaking, we believe that any toying with changing the target is quite a dangerous exercise, and so it shouldn't be changed. It's like moving the gate poles during the soccer game. We're going back to 4% target, depending upon what kind of period the economy is going through because of the structural changes. But our inflation target at this point in time remains unchanged, 4%. And the fact that during the spring, the annual inflation might end up being below 4%. Once again, this is the base effect. Our target is not just to simply touch this level of 4%, but to sustain this target at the level of 4%, because that makes the lending rates more moderate and extends the maturity of such loans. As far as impacting the lending rates is concerned, and of course the lending rates are being affected not by the key rate, but also the market's perception of the way this rate will evolve, and other factors as well. The inflationary expectations for long term, because we're talking about long-term loans. That's why I believe that the banks are going to see the risks of individual borrowers and take all of this into account when defining their transfer curves. Would you add something? And about the signal. Well, that's the signal in terms of whether it might affect the lending rates. All right, thank you very much. The next question comes from the city of Omsk, Olga Grigorieva, channel number 12. 12th channel. Good afternoon, Olga Grigorieva from Omsk. From unofficial sources, it became known that commercial banks are getting ready for the central bank's increase of the key rate as the result of the oil and gas income going down 30% in January. And it was heard that the key rate is going to be at 7% rate. Why the financial market doesn't have any confidence in the central bank's decision, and what should they rely on when reading through the central bank forecast? Thank you. Well, our previous forecast for the average key rate for this year was 6.5% to 8.5%. You know, that was the range given. So we have further specified this forecast of the key average rate to 7 to 9%, and that is the information that the market players can follow. But when making a decision towards investment projects, business development and expansion for households, what to consume, what to save, of course, one of the key indicators is not our key rate, rather than the inflation expectation, the price stability. So to us, it is crucially important to go back to our targets so that households have trust in the businesses and the businesses have trust in the price stability. Would you add something, Mr. Zapotkin? Yeah, very briefly. A certain imaginary, hypothetical description. Low inflation, 4% level is where we're moving, and that's where we're trying to keep the economy at, while the interest rates within this context, thinking about the economy as a vessel, the ship, the key rate is a steering wheel, and the navigator plots the course, and the steerer keeps the course, and so the target for that course is our forecast. But if it so happens there's a storm, or the weather forecast changes, or another ship is crossing the path with us, so you have to turn the steering wheel, and that is a key rate change for you. But then the course has been recalculated, and that means that the forecast is being re-established. Anna Fyodorova, Fyodor Ivanov, InvestFuture. I have two questions. The first one is about the labor market. Quite often we hear about a really solid labor market, but the concealed unemployment is growing. So I want to know whether the Bank of Russia, when making its decision and modeling its forecast, does it take into account this hidden unemployment, which the Office of Statistics is not showing. And this level, is it high right now, or is it brought about by certain factors which do not impact the economy? And my second question is about the crude oil prices, because currently there is really a strong issue with the estimation of the Russian oil price, what to take as a benchmark. Last year we had proposals about producing new benchmarks, and so what does the central bank currently take into account when doing its forecast, and what one should, as an analyst or an investor and simply a household, what they should take as a benchmark price? Is there anything suitable for that these days? As far as the labor market and the hidden unemployment is concerned, we do take into account different indicators. Alexei Borisovich will tell you more about it. Yeah, very quickly. This is the question that has already been touched. Indeed, the Russian Office of Statistics, apart from the general unemployment figure, publishes a broader range of indicators, the indicators of partial employment. And I believe that that is what you may have referred to as hidden unemployment. But the Russian Office of Statistics does it at a quarterly basis, using a much broader representation than usual unemployment. But as a basic unemployment indicator based on the third quarter results, these have gone down to the historic low. Probably there's no averaging in between the seasons, but if we do this adjustment by the seasonality, we will see that according to, like in the case of the main unemployment indicator during the third quarter, that as well went down to the minimum low. So in our mind, we are looking quite in detail at these indicators when we discuss the current economic environment, and these confirm our opinion that the labor market is in a quite saturated employment, and in some industries exactly what we hear from our regional branches, which directly communicate with the regional businesses, that a whole number of sectors encounter a growing shortage of hands. As far as the oil price calculation is concerned, indeed this issue has risen, because the Urals benchmark doesn't reflect the real price at which the Russian oil is exported, because exports go through different seaports in different destinations. It may vary, and we see how broadly these price markers have dispersed. So in our forecast, we do take it into account, we analyze it, but of course it's a very hot issue. I mean, benchmarking currently. The St. Petersburg International Commodity Exchange is working over this benchmark. We're part of these discussions, and in order for the analysts to be able to use it, that is indeed very important. Thank you. The next question comes from Evgenia Pismenaya, Bloomberg. Zhenya, go ahead. Good afternoon. Your colleagues, the economists, Oleg Vyugin, Alexei Yegorovich, and Lekets Hokin, they published a big report with analysis of the Russian economy, describing the current situation in Russia as an atypical crisis. To put it into plain words in one phrase, the economy was saved by the record high fiscal income from the exports of energy, which really worked as an effect of mobilizing the windfall profit. But as this income goes down, the economy will have to face a standard set of crises which describe the standard economic crisis, like an investment hunger, chronic fiscal deficit, devaluation, and the contraction of demand. And so they believe that this will kick off this year. Do you agree with your colleagues or not, that there is such a risk? This is my first question. And my second question is about Euroclear. The European Clearance Bank receives currently from the frozen Russian asset quite an interest, which is not allocating anywhere $821 million of interest that they received from the Russian money that has got stuck there. Does Russia try to bring this money back, and will it claim to also have the interest? And my third little question, I think you've commented on it already, to a certain extent, that you're going to monitor situation with the oil production cut. Has the government sought your advice when making a decision about it? And generally speaking, what kind of economic consequences this step may lead to? Thank you. As far as our assessment of the situation and its future are concerned, first of all, in my mind, apart from the factor that you mentioned, export prices growing, I mean, for the Russian goods, quite a significant effect over the Russian economy came from its ability to very quickly adjust itself, as well as on the part of many market players. They were able to find new logistical supply chains, new producers, and we were able to see how faster than our expectations, import rebounded, and that boosted the Russian economic stability. And the fact that all these entities played to the market rules, that helped the economy to adjust so quickly. As far as different other issues are concerned related to the investment dynamics, fiscal policy, yes, indeed, we're currently witnessing the growing importance of government investment. But I'm coming from the fact that we know that the government is also working over the measures to improve the incentivization towards private investment activity. It depends upon the way the businesses understand the future of demand dynamics, and overall depends upon the ability to assess the uncertainties or certainties. It is very important to have private investment engaged. On our part, we do everything in order for the financial market, amongst other instruments, to act as a source for private investment. As far as the budget deficit is concerned, we see the government policy aimed at gradual budget consolidation, and that's what we act on. But in terms of the 2023, there being any negative consequences, we don't see that. Now, with regard to Euroclear and the frozen assets, well, we are doing our work through all possible channels to protect the investor rights as well as our own rights and entitlements to these assets. We also do preparatory work towards that end. As far as the oil production decline is concerned, no, the government made its own mind. That is its authority. We will continue assessing the economic consequences. Yes, it will impact somehow prices and export volumes, but that will require some time to understand. Most probably we will do it by the next core board of directors meeting in April. Dear colleagues, please. Yes, Ivan, now in the first row. Good afternoon, Ivan Schliegen for MAG through RU. A couple of questions. The first one is about the banking sector, because multiple analysts and experts, all in unison, are very optimistic in their assessment of the domestic banking sector this year. Covering all of the players practically. Is it true that it is so well doing, or is it because of a shortage of disclosed reports? My second question about the RMB bonds by the domestic issues. Will this market continue to develop? Will there appear any new instruments, or is it just a temporary phenomenon? Thank you. Thank you. As far as the situation in the banking industry is concerned, It is true that the banking sector encountered some serious challenges, but was able to persevere and keep up its stability. And there was no credit contraction, and the lending activity continued to grow. In many ways, that happened due to the fact that over the previous years, capital and buffers, so-called buffers, have been established. We provided certain regulatory easing, but this regulatory easing, practically, is something that we gradually were stepping out of. Many of such serious easing has been curtailed, maybe apart from the additional markups on the macroprudential markups in terms of the capital adequacy requirements. Will definitely go over the next 5 years with it, but these markups, they enable in good years to increase the capital. They're being eaten through during the crisis, then they're being recouped again. That doesn't affect the basic adequacy requirements points. But in as far as the lack of disclosure is concerned, we understand that information, that the reporting needs to be disclosed, and we have agreed that as of Q1 we will start these disclosing practices. Certain things are going to be aggregated into this reporting, but in terms of the financial status, everything is going to be quite transparent there. In as far as RMB bonds by the Russian investors are concerned, yes, this market, by the Russian issues, the market is developing. This is not accidental. The interest towards such instruments is growing. Now, in terms of the future dynamics of it, we shall see, but I don't think that this is some temporary thing, because the RMB-denominated instruments, I'm sure, are going to take up some share of this market. Next question comes from the city of Oriol, Elvira Nabiullina. Arguments and Facts, newspaper from Oriol. Good afternoon. I've got the following question. What kind of currency we should use in order to peg the future of the ruble to? We've used to do that with the dollar and currency. Maybe it should be done now with a different currency in mind, RMB. Well, broadly speaking about the position of the ruble, it's about its purchasing power rather than the ability to buy a certain amount of euros or dollars, but the amount of products and services that ruble can buy. And you should rather compare it to your consumption basket. That is why we are working towards price stability, so that the purchasing power of our national currency should not be undervalued or devalued or undermined. And actually what we see is that by using different currencies in international settlements, preference is placed not only upon the currency based upon the nature of their breadth of international coverage, but also preference is given to the rubles that are not undermined by inflation. As far as the foreign trade is concerned, the ruble's position must be assessed within the basket of currencies that trade is being done with. Thank you. Katya Litova in the last row. Good afternoon, Ekaterina Litova, Vedomosti. What would you comment on the information coming from some of the media that the government was putting pressure upon the central bank, trying to force it towards more optimistic forecast, and so that it would give a signal to the market about its readiness to soften its monetary policy within 2023 already? Well, in terms of monetary policy, we pursue it independently. We are independent in making our decision about the key rate. And in my mind, that is the only way that you can control inflation with. And the government is very well aware of the importance of the price stability for the economic sustainability. Of course, we cooperate with the government on a broad range of issues, and we exchange our views and our forecast assessments. In our policy, we take into account the government policy, the fiscal policy in the first place, and I know that the government reciprocally in its fiscal policy also takes into account our monetary policy. Thank you. Please, colleagues, Aliona. Elvira Nabiullina, Russia 24. I would like to ask you about the future possibility using the cryptocurrencies in the national settlement. Similarly, the central bank has always been quite diligent in terms of the cryptocurrency, but the news has come out that Russia and Iran might come up with a stable coin which will be pegged to gold. As far as I understand, for that purpose, you would need to change legislature. What is the time frame that we can talk about here, and when exactly we might see cryptocurrencies used in these intergovernmental settlement, and what kind of advantages you see this for the economy? We never changed our position towards this. We are negative towards using cryptocurrencies in the national market, in our domestic settlements. If the economic entities might find it useful to use cryptocurrency in external trading, we are ready to accept that. But as far as all kinds of stable coins and the possibility to apply it in bilateral settlements in between countries, that really requires very deep consideration. And such issues are too far away from specific propositions. Thank you. The next question comes from a blogger, Olga Gogaladze, Pro-Finance Project. Good afternoon. I have a question about the digital ruble, about the timing for when it is going to be introduced and when people might start using their digital purses. Well, we are currently piloting the digital ruble. We've got more than a dozen of banks involved actively in it, in a beta testing mode. This year, we are planning to try and pilot it through real transactions with real customers, but for that purpose, certain amendments have to be introduced into the legislation, and these amendments have been prepared, and currently they're being discussed, and we hope that shortly these are going to be also discussed by the Russian Parliament, so as afterwards to try and test them in real life, and then stage by stage roll it out. It's definitely going to be rolled out quite gradually. Thank you. Marina, please. Hello, Marina Pimenova, NTV Business News. What will bring the GDP growth, considering the fact that the effect from the oil sanctions is not yet clear? And my second question, there have been some reports that Russia may allow to open the affiliate offices of the foreign banks. So what do you think about this idea? And at what stage the discussion is currently passing through? Mrs. Zapotkin, will you please answer the first question? You are absolutely correct. The scale of the impact from sanctions upon the oil sector is something that we still need to be able to assess fully and monitor it, and to a certain extent that explains the breadth of our forecast for the GDP this year, -1 +1. But as Elvira Nabiullina explained, a gradual step-by-step growth, quarter to quarter, we see consistently in the economy based on the results of the fourth quarter, and the growth which is partially brought about by revival and adaptation and adjustment will continue through the current year. So there would be the growth from in the fourth quarter next year on year to the fourth quarter this year, but the overall forecast shall depend, and the actual result will depend upon what we will go through. As far as permitting the foreign banks to set up their affiliates, we are positive about this idea, but beforehand, the affiliates which are going to do various transactions and services without using household deposits. That's the kind of a draft legislation that we're discussing. Ina, in the last row, please. Ina Aldoshina, Frank Media. I will have several questions. The first one, the first president of the response from the developers towards the central banks restricting the lending at the zero rate happened. There is a cashback now from the developers. It's the same kind of an arrangement. An apartment is more expensive. People go into the mortgage lending in order to afford it. How are you going to react to these kind of schemes and maybe apply certain measures upon the lending banks? Could you please tell us? Another question is, towards the end of 2022, the credit bureaus reported on the share of the approved application for the consumer loans went down. So what do you think about this trend? What's your expectation? Is it a critical problem, or maybe you conversely support the banks being so scrutinous about their customers and so picky? Thirdly, the part of the credit subordinated loan, returning it by Bank is being considered. Do you believe that this money made available will be redirected to support some other banks? As far as different schemes by developers are concerned, you're absolutely right. Certain new schemes have emerged with cashbacks. In the meantime, they are not over the counter. But we're ready to switch on our regulatory measures. We do see risks here, but principally I would like to say that very much concerned we are by the fact that such schemes are multiplying, are growing. One is being closed, another is surfacing. And certainly you can use regulatory measures exactly like we intend to do, but if these schemes grow in numbers, we will insist upon legislation being amended so that the household money with the equity participation would follow only what's written in the legislation without any deviation from it, because these ways of bypassing the law through such schemes represent risks to the borrowers. And again, if such schemes appear in numbers, we will be extremely insistent to amend the law. As far as your question about loans and about banks being picky, the first thing that I want to say, there is no loan contraction. Yes, we had a bit of a gap during the spring last year, and then lending actively started recovering. Corporate lending, even last year, it was even higher than in 2021, 14%, although there's a bit of a share of substitution of the loans which fell out because of the external borrowing. The mortgaging against, after the serious decline at the end of the year, came up with a 20% growth, which is quite a significant figure. And over the past few months, it was able to recover the kind of the mortgage loan growth, which we remember in 2020, 2021. So that happened quite quickly. And what we're concerned by, the quality of these loans, because we do see that in the consumer unsecuritized loans, which recovered not as strongly. That is what we have been concerned by, high rates of growth. But so in the consumer lending, the share of loans to the overburdened borrowers is growing. And in the mortgage lending, we do see certain shifts in the primary market. For example, the share of loans by the borrowers with the original contribution of less than 20%, this share has reached 69%. And the primary contribution and the level, it is an indication of the reliability of the borrower. And so here we're going to very cautiously monitor it, and whenever needed, we will apply macroprudential regulatory measures. We have them in our hands so as to ensure respective quality of the loan. Otherwise, that may end up with problems on the side of the borrowers and various social problems as well. So that is what we are doing. This monitoring, and we are instantly ready to switch on macroprudential measures. Oh, right, yes, the return of the subordinated loan, that's more about the government law. I think that should be the authority of the government to decide. Of course, we would very much like it to return in the form of the capital into the banking system so as to strengthen the banking capital base. We're always interested in that. Thank you. The next question from Belgorod, from Sergei Shevchenko. Belpressa. online portal. Good afternoon. I've got the following question. The Bank of Russia, throughout 2022, already noted how consumers switched to a saving behavioral model. How strong was the contribution from that into the reduction of the pro-inflationary risks? And my second question, this particular trend, doesn't it bring about additional risk of demand in individual sectors plummeting? Thank you very much for this question. The propensity to save, the saving model, against other things being equal, I should note, leads to the consumer demand going down. And this is one of the important factors which held back price growth in the second half of last year when the price growth rate was quite low. But nowadays, we already see the indications of the consumer activity growing, particularly in January, in the beginning of February. The advanced indicators do point to the consumer activity growing. And so in our base forecast, what we note is that the savings rate will gradually go down in the course of this year. But I would like to state at the same time, any prerequisites pointing to the propensity to save and the consumer demand, this is household behavior. That carries within an additional uncertainty, and the trends can turn around very quickly. Trends can pivot this or there, particularly against the high inflationary expectations. And although consumers these days, their behavior remains extremely cautious, and that may compensate for the pro-inflationary risks in other channels that we mentioned. But we must be very watchful of these because the trends may turn around. Thanks very much, colleague Sergey. Second row. Sergey Bolotov. Hooray-roo! Since last board meeting on the key rate in December, the ruble weakened against the dollar by about 13%. Could you please tell us, how does that affect inflation? And will the Bank of Russia react in case the ruble continues to fall at the same rate? Well, also, people, whenever they see it, they feel the need to start buying currency, maybe not the US dollar, but the currencies from the friendly countries. Could you please advise which they should do? Well, as far as the exchange rate dynamics is concerned, definitely it influences inflation. The exchange rate appreciating, this is the disinflationary inflation. The depreciation, this is the pro-inflationary factor. The weakening of the exchange rate last year has already been taken into account in prices, maybe not all of it. The lag here, we believe, takes up some 6 months. And we take into account the exchange rate dynamics whenever we decide about the key rate, but this is not the only factor. For example, if the exchange rate pace brings about pro-inflationary risks, there may be other disinflationary factors, and on balance, they may be stronger. And so with this regard, they may not be the reason for the rate to be brought up. So we take into account the whole combination of the risks and factors in as far as which currency you should keep your money in. We do everything in order for people to keep their money in rubles so that the ruble savings are not losing value. Mr. Zabotkin, I think it's a very important premise that the exchange rate is an important thing, and it impacts the monetary policy in exactly the way it impacts the inflation expectation. If we remember the one that we had in terms of the inflation expectations in January, in December, the expectations went down compared to November. They remain elevated. And I guess the weakening of the exchange rate that occurred in December somewhat was in the way for them to go down faster, but one must acknowledge that the reaction of the inflation expectation towards the exchange rate volatility cannot be described as excessive. Next question comes from a blogger, Victoria Shergina, Law and Finance. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the opportunity to ask you a question. Investors won't forgive me if I don't do that. Are there any news available in terms of unfreezing foreign assets? Because you mentioned that preparatory work is underway. Are there any details that you can disclose? Because the conditional monthly period since January 7th is already expired, but there is no information. Yes, indeed, the work is ongoing. And it was the decision about the foreign regulators about the possibility of unblocking, and the prevalent majority of investors had enough time to submit their applications within the statutory timing, but there is no answer yet. There's no response. But we, of course, are interested in having this problem solved. Dear colleagues, Juliana, the second row. Good afternoon. CGN, Russian Media Corporation from China. I've got several questions. The first one, because of the sanctions, there is a risk for the currency inflow into Russia falling. If it happens, how does that may impact the banking system and inflation specifically? My second question, do we have enough of RMB reserves so as to stabilize the financial system? And to continue Olga Gogoladze's question about the digital ruble, it is known that China has a very successful experience with the digital RMB. Are you possibly having any negotiations or interacting with the Chinese authorities, trying to use their experience, amongst other things? As far as the sanctional impact is concerned, we view that through the payment balance, because that affects export, imports, and the current account. And that also influences the exchange rate and inflation, just to simplify this chain of command for you. And of course, the embargo decision for oil and petroleum products, we all take it all in our forecast. But not only the export dynamics, but also import dynamics impact, because we see that import has rebounded quite quickly. And so this aggregate effect from all these factors give us the reason to reduce our estimate of the positive current account for this year, but it remains significantly positive, which we would also take into account in the exchange rate. As far as RMB and the sufficiency of it, we're currently selling RMB as part of the fiscal rule. No other transactions we do with RMB, and we believe the volume is sufficient enough specifically for the kind of transactions which take place within the fiscal rule format. As far as the digital currency is concerned, we are thoroughly studying the Chinese experience and its introduction of the digital RMB. Our counterparts are really moving very quickly, and we certainly do research other countries' experiences. And in the future, it is possible that we will debate these issues with different countries so as to maybe use the digital currencies to do the mutual settlements and the digital currencies by the central banks make this possible. Thank you. The next question comes from Elena Fabricna from Reuters. How the share of RMB in the gold and currency reserves went down in selling the currency. When are you going to buy currency? Is it possible to expect your purchasing of the currency this year? Once again, I shall repeat. In continuing to answer the previous question, we are doing the RMB sales as tasked by the Minister of Finance as part of the fiscal rule application. And since the point in time when we started selling RMB, we sold them by about 84.3 billion rubles worth. And this is the data that we actually published. Maybe with a one-day delay, you can take a look at our charts, the liquidity. It is all transparent. We're not doing anything other than that. Now, as to when we will start buying RMB, that depends upon how the basic oil and gas income will be demonstrating itself. If the annual income will be assessed at the level above 8 trillion rubles, then in the very same fashion as a fiscal rule agent, we will start purchasing RMBs. Now, will it happen this year? It all depends upon the way situation may evolve in the market, and first and foremost from the point of view of the oil and gas revenue. Colleagues, please, Ksenia. Yes, the last row. Hello, my name is Ksenia Paderina. I'm the financial blogger and a journalist. I've got the following question. Is there any news about the draft law about the self-prohibition on lender? Because there is an order from the central bank that a person can contact the bank and switch on this prohibition, this ban. And it doesn't work. So there has to be some sort of a centralized law put in place for people to be able to do that. And my second question comes out of the first one. What else does Bank of Russia plan to do in order to protect people from financial frauders? Well, we naturally support and promote this idea so that people could impose a self-ban on loan-taking, online loan-taking in the first place, and setting a limitation threshold on money transfer, because this is a very common fraud scheme when somebody, on behalf of somebody, takes a loan and then once in the individual's account, transfer this money to a different account. We, as a central bank, issued a notification to the banks, obliging them to provide their customers with such a service in online lending and online transfer to make it possible for customers to switch on these limitations. Some of the banks did it. Some other banks require technical preparation for it. And following our instructions, they're supposed to finish it by July 1st. In our mind, we still need the law to cover it, because outside of regulation, what remains is lending done through offices. So we need to curtail all possible channels of fraud. And this is not only the only channel where we fight fraud. By way of an example, I can explain to you the measure that we believe necessary to have a 2-day cooling period for electronic transfers. When a transfer is being effected to the accounts of the criminals who are in the Central Bank of Russia database, and the information from this database is what we share with the banks. So if a fraudster is in such a database and the request is being received for the money to be transferred, there should be a 2-day cooling period so that the bank must warn its customer. If it didn't warn the customer and did this transaction, the bank will have to compensate the customer for the full amount. That is the idea that we support. There are other means and other mechanisms, and so fighting fraud remains one of our priority in the financial market. Thank you. Next question from Tatiana Chubasova, Interfax. Please, Tanya. Good afternoon. I've got several questions. In the beginning of this year, the central bank was given the right to open up the C-type accounts, and the banks, until the middle of January, were supposed to do that. Could you please explain what were the purposes that the Deposit Insurance Corporation received this kind of authority? Because as far as I understand, it's all about creating a certain compensatory fund for the Russian investors, and what is the amount of money that so far has been accumulated on these accounts in the Deposit Insurance Corporation. My second question, what the central bank intends to do from the money it gets from divesting from the Odkutia Bank. My third question is related to the dividends. Minister of Finance stated that yesterday it waits for the dividends that the central bank should pay it for 2022, guided by the Minister of Finance being a shareholder, and the government needs money in case the income base is shrinking. Now, how the central bank agrees as a regulator that the profit-making banks can pay dividends without a risk to the capital is not going to be a temporary decision. Thank you so much. As far as the first question is concerned, until recently, the C account funds were reflected in the National Reserve Depository, and in the end of the day, in the year, the Minister of Finance decided that instead of the National Reserve Depository, it will be the Deposit Insurance Corporation that will make sure that for the full integrity of this asset, the status is not changing. Everything remains, all of the commitments, all of the obligations remain in full. As far as the compensatory fund is concerned, then the decision to transfer funds from National Depository into the depository company, insurance company, wasn't in any way discussed because it will depend upon what the foreign regulators decide upon unfreezing the assets and money belonging to our citizens, and later on we will decide on whether it would make sense to still consider it. In terms of the amount of funds, we're not disclosing this, but of course in time these grow as far as the money earned from the divestiture from the equity. We're not going to do anything special about it. We will simply reflect it in our income line. As far as the dividend payment is concerned, we have worked out various approaches to the dividend policies, which take into account the fact of the banks using the regulatory easements. As I told you, some of them have been suspended, but in terms of the standards and macroprudential markups and the capital adequacies, we've granted 5-year grace. That's about the markups for being a systemic bank, a systemically significant entity, and for maintaining capital adequacy 2.5%. For this year, we have set it at 0, and we have granted 5-year grace period for these to be established in full. And so if the banks do abide by this schedule, they are entitled to pay dividends out of the past and current year profits up to 50%. If their financial status is such that they come to the level of the standards which were in place before our easing, they can pay dividends without any limitations. But of course, if they are in violation of certain standards, they don't have the right to pay dividends. Thank you, dear colleagues, and I guess this is the last question. Maria, please. Good afternoon, Kobo Maria from Izvestia Gazette. I've got 2 questions. First of all, previously it was stated that there are certain legal reasons for some of the partially frozen assets to be used by the central bank. Are you planning to respond to that? Are you going to file suits? And in terms of lending, you also mentioned that you are going to introduce the lending grace period for the consumer loans on a permanent basis. When this mechanism is going to kick in, don't you see the risks of overburdening, the Russians overburdening themselves with loans in such a mechanism environment? As far as raising claims in court is concerned, as I mentioned multiple times, that this is a very complex process legally. We are preparing ourselves. This work is ongoing. As far as the grace period for the credit grace period is concerned, we support having such grace period, as a working measure. But the mechanism will be put in place once the law is brought into effect. In terms of households overburdening themselves with loans, it's an important indicator because we see that the consumer borrowing has recovered, but the pace of growth is not yet quite high. And here, it is not only important to watch over the pace of growth, but also the quality, as I previously mentioned, in order to avoid a fast-growing share of the loans which are being given to overburdened borrowers. So over-crediting, that's the way we describe it in terminology. So it's not about loans themselves, but about the quality of lending and borrowers. Thank you very much, dear colleagues, for your interest. Thank you.